My daughter has spent 37 years being a disappointment to this family, and I think it's time everyone here finally knew the truth about her. My mother's voice didn't rise above the ambient noise of the hall. It didn't need to. The Remembrance Day luncheon at the Royal Canadian Legion in Oakville draws about 200 people every November. Veterans, their families, local politicians, people who showed up because they felt they ought to. The room was mid-conversation, forks clinking, wine glasses condensing rings onto white tablecloths. And then it wasn't. 200 people held perfectly still. She was standing at the microphone that the Legion commander had just vacated. I hadn't even seen her take it. I was sitting at a table near the back, still in my dress uniform, coffee cooling in front of me, when I heard my own name leave her mouth like something being discarded. She turned to the man seated at the head table beside the mayor. Warrant Officer Second Class Conrad Beaumont, 6 deployments, decorated twice for service in Afghanistan, face on the Legion's centennial poster 3 years running. She placed her hand on his arm the way you touch something you're proud to own. Now this man, she said, this is the kind of person who makes a family proud. Real courage, real sacrifice. Not someone who hides behind a desk in a basement somewhere, doing God knows what, collecting a government paycheck for paperwork, the room murmured. My uncle shifted in his seat with the satisfied expression of a man watching a play he'd already seen. My cousin laughed. Just once, sharp, then looked down at his bread plate. Conrad Beaumont was not laughing. He was staring at the insignia on my collar, at the crest above my breast pocket. His face went through something I had only seen once before, in a photograph of a soldier the moment he understood he was still alive. His jaw came slightly open. He set his water glass down on the table with extreme care, the way you handle something you suddenly realize might be fragile. And then, in a voice that the microphone picked up and sent into every corner of that hall, he said, You're the quiet architect?" My mother's hand slipped from his arm. But before I tell you why those 2 words collapsed everything she had spent 20 years building in that room, and what Conrad Beaumont said next that made a 91-year-old RCAF veteran push himself to his feet, stay with me, because the part that destroyed her wasn't anything I said. I grew up in a house in Burlington that looked, from the outside, like every reasonable expectation of childhood. Double garage, mature maple in the front yard. My mother kept the flower beds immaculate, which I later understood was not out of love for flowers, but because neighbors talk. And what neighbors see first is the outside of things. Inside was a different architecture entirely. I was 9 years old the first time I understood my value in that house was conditional. I'd left my homework on the kitchen table. A science project, poster board covered in diagrams of the water cycle I'd stayed up until 11 drawing because I wanted it to be good. She came in, looked at it, looked at me and said, "You have your father's brain, unfortunately." Then she turned it face down and set a fruit bowl on top of it. My father was an engineer who had died of a heart attack when I was 4. I have almost no memory of him. She mentioned him only to wound with him. His intelligence was a deficiency to her, evidence that I'd inherited the wrong genetic package. The second understanding arrived when I was 12. I'd made the provincial honor roll. My homeroom teacher, Mrs. Arsenault, had called the house personally to tell her. I came home to find the letter from the school board sitting in the recycling bin, unopened, still in the envelope. When I pointed this out, my mother set her tea down and looked at me with genuine puzzlement, as though I'd pointed out a smudge on the ceiling that she couldn't be expected to care about. "Honor roll," she said. "For what school? That little school? Patricia, that's not an achievement. That's just a participation award they give to the quiet ones so they feel included." I was not a quiet child. I was a child who had learned to make herself smaller in that house, which is not the same thing. She remarried when I was 14. My stepfather was a general contractor with a son from his first marriage named Crispin, who was 16, who played hockey and had opinions about everything, and who my mother decided was the prototype she had always wanted and never received. Within 6 months, Crispin's hockey schedule determined the family calendar. Crispin's college plans were discussed at dinner. Crispin's opinions about the TV remote, about the dinner menu, about where we'd spend Christmas were entertained with the patience of an audience waiting for an encore. My plans, I had quietly applied to the Royal Military College of Canada, were not discussed at dinner because she didn't know about them. I had understood early that presenting her with my ambitions was identical to handing her scissors. The night I received the acceptance letter from RMC, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time with the envelope in my lap. It was February, and the street outside was blue-white from snow, and I could hear her laughing at something on television downstairs, and I made a decision I've never once regretted. I put the letter in the inside pocket of my winter coat and didn't tell her. I didn't tell her for 6 weeks, until the financial documents required her signature. She read the RMC letterhead. She set it on the kitchen counter without looking at me. "You're not serious. I am the military." She said it the way you'd say a diagnosis. "You can't even parallel park." What are you going to do in the military, Patricia? March in a straight line? My stepfather tried once, gently, to suggest it was a prestigious institution. She talked over him before he'd finished the sentence. She signed the documents eventually. She had to. But she signed them the way you sign something under duress, with the pen held at an angle that communicated everything she felt about the exercise. I left in August with a single duffel bag and the letter folded in my coat pocket. She didn't come to the door. RMC is structured to remove everything you thought you knew about yourself, and then examine whether what's underneath is worth keeping. The first year was 12-hour days, cold water, sleep deprivation, a level of physical and psychological pressure designed to find every fault line in a person and stress test it to failure. I failed 4 times in the first month. I got up 5 times. What I discovered in that first year was not that I was exceptional. What I discovered was that the voice in my head that had spent 14 years telling me I was moderate, tolerable at best, specifically and structurally incapable of anything remarkable, that voice had my mother's cadence. And the voice that surfaced when I stopped listening to her voice was quieter and steadier and did not blink under pressure. My thesis supervisor, Colonel Byrne, pulled me aside after a strategic analysis simulation in my 3rd year. I had solved a 3-sided resource conflict in the simulation by doing something the manual explicitly didn't recommend: sacrificing a communication hub to force the opposing position into a predictable response pattern, then closing 3 vectors simultaneously from directions they weren't monitoring. Colonel Byrne looked at my solution for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Where did you learn to think like this?" I told him I wasn't sure. He said, "Start being sure. Because whoever trained you to see laterally in a crisis did you a significant service." Nobody had trained me. I had spent 14 years in a house where the front door looked like safety and the inside was a different country entirely, and learning to read the gap between what was presented and what was actually happening, learning to see the exits other people weren't watching. That was survival, not education. After RMC, I went into intelligence analysis. I can't tell you most of what that means, which is the nature of that work. What I can tell you is that my job for 15 years was to understand how bad things happen before they happen. To map the negative space around an operation, the places where the plan assumed safety and the reality contained threat. To read the architecture of a crisis the way other people read weather. The assignment that changed my career came 7 years in. A multi-agency operation involving 3 NATO partners had stalled because the threat model had a gap in it. A specific communications vulnerability that the Joint Task Force hadn't identified, but that I flagged from 18 months of pattern analysis on a sequence of signals that individually meant nothing but collectively described a frequency rotation that had been used twice before, once in Kandahar, once in a small town in Bosnia in 1997 that most people in the room were too young to remember. I brought it to my commanding officer, Major Desjardins, at 0300 on a Tuesday. He read my report for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "If you're right, you've just prevented a catastrophic friendly fire incident." I was right. The debrief produced a single line in a document that will be classified for another 30 years. Architectural vulnerability identified by Signals Intelligence Analyst, Ghost Unit, File Reference QA047. The code phrase that came out of the subsequent team debrief, used informally among the Joint Task Force personnel who knew what had almost happened, was the quiet architect. Because whoever had designed the invisible framework that caught what the official plan missed had done it entirely without announcement. That name moved through certain rooms for a few years. I never used it myself. I never acknowledged it in any official capacity. Names like that only exist in the spaces between formal records, passed person to person among people who understand what they're referring to, and that is exactly where that name lived. Conrad Beaumont had been part of the Joint Task Force debrief. He knew precisely what those 2 words meant. The letters I sent home from RMC were answered intermittently, and then not at all. I sent a photograph of myself in dress uniform after my commissioning ceremony, 2nd Lieutenant, standing in the cold November light outside the Mackenzie building. The photograph came back to me 3 weeks later with a post-it note on the back in her handwriting: "Return to sender, wrong address. We had not moved." That was a choice she made deliberately, and she made it carefully enough that she could claim a clerical error if anyone ever asked. I stopped sending letters after that. She did not stop talking. My aunt told me, years later, what she'd been saying at family gatherings: that I dropped out of university and joined the military because I couldn't get into a real program, that I had a desk job filing documents on a base somewhere in Ontario, that she worried about me, of course, but some people are simply not built for high expectations. That Crispin, on the other hand, had just been made a regional manager at 26, which was not a surprise to anyone who'd watched him grow up. My grandmother died while I was on an assignment that required me to be unreachable for 9 days. By the time I could get to a phone, She had been buried, and the reception had been held, and the photographs had been organized into an album that did not include me because I hadn't been there. When I arrived at my mother's house the following week, she opened the door, looked at me, and said, "You couldn't even make it to your grandmother's funeral." I had been in a secure facility performing work I was not permitted to describe. I had not chosen to be unreachable. I said something to that effect. She turned and walked back into the kitchen and said over her shoulder, "There's always an excuse with you." That was the last time I stepped inside that house for 4 years. I came to the Legion luncheon because Sergeant Major Webb requested it, and when Sergeant Major Webb requests your presence in dress uniform at a Remembrance Day function, you say yes and you show up on time. He didn't tell me my mother would be there. I suspect he didn't know. She had been involved in planning the civilian side of the event through her garden club, and in the specific way that my mother operated, she had quietly made herself indispensable enough to the organizing committee that she'd secured a seat near the head table and a moment at the microphone. I recognized the maneuver the second I walked in. I'd seen it before in other configurations, other rooms. I found a chair near the back, left aisle, with my back to the wall and a clear line to the exit, not because I planned to use it, but because 15 years in my line of work means you don't sit anywhere without knowing where the exits are. I scanned the head table, identified Conrad Beaumont immediately, registered his decorations, understood that whoever had arranged his seating next to the mayor had done so deliberately for optics. I did not anticipate being the optics. She took the microphone after the Legion commander finished the land acknowledgement and the formal reading of the names. I had my head slightly bowed. I heard my name before I looked up. By the time I raised my eyes, she was already into it, voice smooth and certain and honed from 20 years of practice. My disappointment to this family, my hiding behind a desk, my government paycheck, her hand on Conrad Beaumont's arm. The son she'd chosen instead, the real sacrifice, the genuine courage. The room held still the way rooms do when everyone understands they are watching something they will not be able to explain later. I sat with my hands flat on the table. I counted my breaths, 4 in, 7 hold, 8 out, heart rate steady, face still. I had learned to receive fire in rooms far more dangerous than a Legion Hall in Oakville. And then Conrad Beaumont's expression broke open, and his voice went into the microphone, and the room changed. You're the quiet architect?" What followed was the particular silence of a room full of people recalibrating simultaneously. My mother's laugh arrived on a slight delay, engineered for recovery. "Oh, Conrad, don't flatter her. She pushes paper. She always has." "Ma'am," Conrad Beaumont said it quietly, but the microphone carried it to the back wall. He stood up, straight, squared. 200 grams of metal hardware catching the light as he turned to face her directly. "With respect, you don't know what your daughter does." The table near the front where the senior veterans were seated, I counted 4 of them, 3 RKF, 1 Army, all men in their 80s and 90s, had gone completely still. Conrad looked out at the room, not at my mother, not at me, at the room. 7 years ago, he said, I was part of a joint task force operation that went sideways in a way that should have cost us 14 people, military personnel. Ours, allied forces, it shouldn't matter. 14 people who were going to die because a gap in the threat model hadn't been identified. He paused. One analyst, working alone, without resources, without authorization in the formal sense, without anyone asking her to, mapped the invisible architecture of that plan, found what we missed. Got it to the right person at the right hour. Not one person died, not one. He looked down at the table for a moment. I know 14 families who do not know how close they came. I know them because I am one of them. I would not be standing here if the quiet architect had not been working in the dark while the rest of us were running the official plan. My mother opened her mouth. He turned and looked at her, just looked. The way someone looks at a map that has given them wrong directions for the last 3 hours. "The woman you just called a disappointment," he said, "is the reason some of the people in this room still have sons." My uncle's hand stopped moving toward his wine glass. He set it back down. My cousin looked up from his bread plate for the first time since this started, and then looked immediately away. The specific avoidance of a man who understands he has been sitting on the wrong side of something. The veteran at the front left, 91 years old, I later found out, RKF navigator, Korean War, hands visibly arthritic from 20 meters away, placed both palms flat on the table and pushed himself to standing, slowly, with the deliberate economy of motion that says every degree of effort is intentional. He raised his right hand to his brow, textbook, held it there. Then the man beside him stood, then a woman 2 tables over, Navy Reserve officer's insignia on her blazer. Then 4 more, no applause, no sound, just the soft percussion of chairs pushing back from tables and the standing and the salutes. It is the most expensive gesture in military culture, and you cannot purchase it or perform it into existence. It has to be given by people who understand exactly what they're giving, and it means that what you have done is real and witnessed and will not be made smaller by the person who tried to make it smaller. My mother's microphone hand dropped to her side. I stood, walked forward, my heels on the hardwood. I stopped a meter in front of her and waited until she looked at me. I didn't ask you to understand my work, I said. I never needed that from you. But I'm going to need you to understand this. The uniform is not a prop for your speech. Don't do this again. She didn't speak. Her face did something I had spent 37 years waiting to see it do. Not crumple, not break, but something smaller and more honest. Like a room in which someone has turned off a light that was always too bright. I turned, walked back through the tables, sat down, and drank the rest of my coffee. She called me 6 days later, not to apologize. My mother does not apologize. She called to explain, which is what she does instead, a long, careful construction of context designed to replace accountability with narrative. The call lasted 11 minutes. She said twice that she had always found the military difficult to understand. She said she worried about me, which was her vocabulary for resenting that she couldn't control me. She said Crispin had asked after me, which I understood was meant to soften something, though I wasn't sure what. I let her talk. I had learned, somewhere around year 35, that what she needed most was the sound of her own voice completing its sentences, and that the most powerful thing I could do in those moments was not fill the space she left. When she finished, I said, I hear you. I said it because it was true. I had heard her. I did not say I accepted what she'd offered, because what she'd offered was not something I could use. It arrived 20 years past the point where it might have mattered, and it came with conditions attached, and I had long since built a life that did not require her foundation to stand on. I said goodbye and hung up. That evening, I drove to the cemetery in Milton, where my father's family had been buried for 3 generations. I hadn't been in 4 years, which I thought about on the drive and didn't resolve. Some things don't resolve. Some things you just carry and acknowledge and try not to set down in inconvenient places. My grandmother's grave was new, the stone still sharp-edged, the inscription not yet softened by weather. I stood there for a while. The November air was dry and cold the way it gets in Ontario in the second week of the month. Not the wet cold of October, but the structural cold that says winter is serious this year. I thought about the photograph I'd sent home from my commissioning ceremony. The one that came back. I thought about Mrs. Arsenault calling the house. About the honor roll letter in the recycling bin. I thought about sitting on the edge of my bed in February with an envelope in my lap and making the decision not to hand her the scissors. I am not someone who performs grief in cemeteries. I don't have the relationship with public feeling that would make that natural. What I have is a habit, developed over many years and many rooms where the wrong expression at the wrong moment costs something real, of knowing when a thing has been completed and when it is still open. I stood at my grandmother's grave and understood that a thing that had been open for a very long time was now quietly closed. Not because my mother had changed. She had not changed. She would not change, because changing requires the capacity to consider that you have been wrong, and that capacity requires a kind of structural honesty she has never possessed. The conversation in the Legion Hall had not produced a new version of her. It had produced a public moment she would eventually re-narrate into something she could tolerate, and she would do this with the same patient competence she brought to everything she wanted to survive. But what had changed was that 200 people, 11 of them veterans who understood exactly what Conrad's testimony had cost him to give publicly, had been present for the truth. And the truth, once spoken into a room that size, does not return to where it came from. I drove home in the dark. The 403 was clear for once, and I made good time. I thought about the 14 families Conrad had mentioned. I thought about the signals pattern I'd spent 18 months assembling, the one that looked like noise until it didn't. I thought about Major Desjardins reading my report at 0300 in 11 minutes of complete silence. I thought about the fact that there is a document in a classified file somewhere that contains, in official government language, the record of what I found and what it prevented, and that my mother will never read it, and that her never reading it was never the point. The work was always the point. The work is still the point. I have colleagues who have carried their families' doubts into their careers, like weight they learned to move under. Some of them are excellent at what they do precisely because the doubt was there. It installed a specific kind of attention in them, a refusal to stop checking, to stop verifying, to assume that what the plan says matches what the situation contains. My mother installed that in me when I was 9 years old, turning my homework face down and setting a fruit bowl on top of it. I have been, in the most technical sense, checking her work ever since. Some people ask whether I've forgiven her, and I've found that question harder to answer than it ought to be, not because the feeling is complicated, but because the word forgiveness describes a transaction, and what I have with my mother is no longer transactional. I stopped waiting for an accounting a long time ago. I stopped keeping the ledger. When you stop keeping the ledger, there is nothing left to forgive. There is just a person who made certain choices, and a life I built in the spaces between the damage those choices caused. And those two things have very little to do with each other now. She is 71 years old. She has her garden and her garden club and her version of every story she has ever lived through. And those versions will hold until they stop holding, and that is not my responsibility to manage anymore. I got home, made tea, fed the cat, read for an hour. Before I went to sleep, I took out my RMC commissioning photograph. I had the original. She had only returned a copy and looked at it for a moment. Second Lieutenant, 22 years old. Standing in the cold November light outside the Mackenzie building with my shoulders squared and my expression doing something I can only describe now as prepared. That woman had no idea what was coming. She also, I noticed now, looked completely unafraid of it. I put the photograph away and turned out the light. The work that needed doing was not done because anyone believed in it beforehand. It was done because I showed up and did it, and stayed inside the room until the room acknowledged that what I was doing was real. That is the only method I have ever found that works. That is the only method there is.